In early December, as the first snowflakes began to fall, Margaret Wilson was planting the last of her bulbs in her home garden. Even at 65, gardening remained her emotional anchor. The memories of her 30 years as an emergency room nurse sometimes haunted her nightmares. In those moments, the scent of soil and the life force of plants would bring her back to reality. Her house, built in the 1980s, was known throughout the Worthington district for its well-maintained gardens. Come spring, tulips would bloom from the bulbs she was now planting. Since her husband Thomas's sudden death from a heart attack 10 years ago, this garden had become her reason for living. On weekends, neighbors would stop by during their walks, looking forward to Margaret's homemade apple pie. She should have been enjoying a peaceful retirement in this quiet suburban neighborhood of Columbus, Ohio. Grandma. Turning around, she saw her 5-year-old granddaughter Emily running toward her, waving her small hands. However, something felt wrong. Her usual energetic gait was missing. She seemed to be dragging her feet slightly. "Emily, be careful." Margaret quickly removed her gloves and spread her arms to embrace her granddaughter. Emily obediently jumped into her grandmother's arms, but her body was noticeably lighter than before. For a child conceived after 7 years of fertility treatments, this weight loss was alarming. "Emily, have you been eating your mother's cooking lately?" "Yes, but Mama says I can't get fat." Emily's voice was small and trembling. Margaret tried to gently roll up her granddaughter's long-sleeved shirt, but Emily quickly withdrew her arm. The gesture was identical to that of abused children she had seen countless times in the emergency room. "Does it hurt?" "No. I'm fine." The response was vague, and Emily's eyes remained fixed on the floor. Margaret's intuition, honed by 30 years of experience with countless abuse cases as a nurse, began raising alarm bells. Her son and daughter-in-law's house was a modern townhouse in a new development, just 15 minutes away by car. Her son James, 38, ran a real estate business. Though outwardly gentle, he had a strong attachment to money. His wife Rachel was a former investment advisor, currently a full-time housewife pregnant with their second child. Just last week at Sunday dinner, she had heard about their $4 million debt from 7 years of IVF treatments, and an additional $2 million loss from an investment scam. "James. Emily doesn't seem well." Her son rushed out to the garden. A momentary look of anxiety crossed his face. She's been a bit under the weather lately. Rachel's worried and making sure she gets plenty of rest." Her son's explanation sounded natural, but there was something artificial about it. Margaret searched for Rachel, her son's wife who was 8 months pregnant. She was watching coldly from inside the house. Recently, Rachel had changed too. Her usual vibrancy had disappeared, replaced by eyes that harbored dark shadows. "Emily, time to go home." Rachel's voice was lower and colder than usual. After that day, Margaret's opportunities to see Emily gradually decreased. Phone calls were met with responses like, "She's not feeling well," or "We're taking her to the doctor." However, Margaret, with her connections to the local medical network, knew they hadn't taken her to any doctor. Every Sunday, after Mass at St. Michael's Catholic Church, she would pray alone. Her former colleagues from Riverside Methodist Hospital would express concern about Emily's situation. "Lord, please let my instincts be wrong." Every time she prayed in church, Margaret felt overwhelmed by anxiety. It was the deepest fear she'd felt since losing her husband 10 years ago. Weekend shopping trips to Kroger hadn't included Emily for quite some time. And her premonitions would prove correct. The day after Rachel learned her second child would be a boy, Emily's condition suddenly worsened. Margaret's nursing experience forewarned her of the worst possible outcome. Since that day, Emily's condition had continued to deteriorate. When Margaret visited her son's house, Emily would sit hiding behind the stairs. The granddaughter who once bounded into her grandmother's arms now cowered like a frightened kitten. In the newly built townhouse, Emily existed like a mere shadow. "Emily, it's Grandma. Everything's all right." Even when called, Emily would only nod slightly. The child who once ran energetically around the garden now lived wrapped in long-sleeved clothes, hiding in shadows. Margaret tried several times to check for bruises on her arms, but Emily desperately refused. Her gestures clearly showed fear. During her time at Riverside Methodist Hospital, Margaret had learned the characteristic behavioral patterns of abused children. Hiding arms and legs, flinching at adult presence, abnormal eating habits. Emily displayed all of these signs. "Have you been eating well lately?" "Yes, but..." Emily glanced around cautiously before continuing in a whisper, as if terrified of being overheard. "I eat, secretly, in my room." Just then, Rachel's voice rang out from the kitchen. A metallic, cold voice from the new stainless steel counter. "Emily. What are you talking about?" At that voice, Emily's body froze for an instant. Margaret was reminded of her nursing days. The countless abuse cases in the emergency room. Children trembling at their parents' voices. And now, her own granddaughter showed the same reaction. 30 years of experience sent out every warning signal. "Rachel, could you tell me who Emily's doctor is?" At Margaret's question, Rachel's eyes widened for a moment. Cradling her 8-month pregnant belly, she showed clear signs of distress. "Oh, yes, but the primary physician is on vacation now." An excuse-like response. Rachel seemed to have forgotten that Margaret knew every pediatrician in the area. None of the doctors she regularly saw at Sunday Mass at St. Michael's Catholic Church had examined Emily. During dinner, Emily showed strange eating habits. She wolfed down her food as if she might not be fed tomorrow. Yet her body was definitely getting thinner. The long-sleeved dress concealed her emaciated frame. "Mama and Papa say I should go to heaven." The words Emily suddenly muttered after dinner froze Margaret's spine. The same bottomless fear that had gripped her when she lost her husband Thomas enveloped her. "Emily, what do you mean?" But before she could answer, Rachel interrupted. Her eyes held a sharp light she'd never shown before. "It's bedtime. Margaret, perhaps you should head home now." As she was leaving, Margaret caught her son in the garage. In the dim light, she searched for traces of her once gentle son. "James, tell me the truth." "Mom, you're worrying too much. Emily's just feeling a bit under the weather." Her son's eyes wouldn't meet his mother's. The pressure of $4 million in fertility treatment debt and $2 million in investment fraud losses had changed her son into a different person. After that, Margaret's opportunities to see Emily drastically decreased. Phone calls were met with responses like, "She's sleeping," or "She's getting tests." However, when she checked with her former colleagues at Ohio Health Riverside Methodist Hospital, there were no records of Emily being admitted anywhere. One day, while passing her son's house after shopping at Kroger, she heard screaming from inside. It was a desperate voice that pierced through the white walls of the modern townhouse. "That's enough. At this rate, everything will." It was Rachel's voice. When Margaret approached the entrance, the voice suddenly stopped. Her son opened the door, sweat glistening on his forehead despite the winter cold. "Mom, she's not feeling well right now. But I just heard screaming. Rachel's morning sickness is severe. She's been on edge with this second pregnancy." Her son's explanation was too perfect. From behind him, Emily's crying could be heard. Her voice contained indescribable suffering. The next day, Rachel's prenatal checkup confirmed the second child would be a boy. From that moment, her son and daughter-in-law's attitude completely changed. They claimed Emily's condition had rapidly deteriorated and, without showing any doctor's diagnosis, completely banned visits. "We found a serious genetic disease. There's a risk of infection, so we can't let you see her, Mom." As a medical professional, Margaret felt something was wrong with her son's explanation. What genetic disease could suddenly appear and pose an infection risk? And above all, why wouldn't they show the doctor's diagnosis? Her 30 years of nursing experience saw through all the lies. While praying in church, Margaret had made her decision. If things continued this way, something irreversible would happen. Her years of nursing experience told her so. The same bottomless anxiety that had engulfed her when she lost her husband wrapped around her. And her premonition would prove correct. One morning, with 2 weeks left until Rachel's due date, her son called. His voice on the other end of the receiver sounded hollow, as if coming from far away. "Mom, Emily has died." In that moment, Margaret's world stopped. Outside the window, Ohio's winter wind howled ominously. The 48 hours after hearing of Emily's death passed like a nightmare. Her son and daughter-in-law were rushing the funeral preparations with unusual haste. They said only family would attend. The cause was stated as acute organ failure due to severe infection, and the coffin was to remain strictly sealed. "The body is too damaged to show you, Mom." Margaret countered her son's words with her 30 years of nursing experience. If it was organ failure from infection, there needs to be a report to the health department. What's the report number? Who was the attending physician? A moment of silence. Her son's face tensed. "Everything's already been arranged. Mom, please don't worry about unnecessary things. That night, Margaret had a dream. Her husband Thomas appeared, telling her to protect Emily. When she woke up covered in sweat, the full moon cast an eerie light through the kitchen window. The day before the funeral, Rachel suddenly went into labor. 2 weeks earlier than expected. "Mom, can you handle the funeral preparations? We need to get to the hospital." After her son and daughter-in-law left for the hospital by ambulance, Margaret was left alone with the funeral director. The man seemed to want to say something. "Mrs. Wilson, actually." He looked around cautiously before continuing in a low voice. "There are strange sounds coming from the coffin." Margaret's heart nearly stopped. "Sounds? What kind of sounds?" "Like someone moving inside." At that moment, a faint sound could definitely be heard from the coffin. The funeral director left with a pale face. Margaret approached the coffin with trembling hands. In her 30 years as an emergency room nurse, she had seen countless corpses. But never had there been such a terrifying moment. And then she heard it. "Help me, help." A faint but unmistakable voice. Emily's voice. The moment Margaret's hand touched the coffin, she felt a slight vibration from within. As she carefully tried to open the lid, she heard the sound of cloth tape peeling from the inside. And then, Grandma. Emily was bound with chains, and cloth tape covered her mouth. It had slightly peeled off from tears and sweat, allowing her voice to leak out. Though her body seemed groggy from sleeping pills, she was definitely alive. "Emily." "It's all right, Grandma's here." Margaret quickly began undoing her granddaughter's restraints. Her efficiency was exactly what she had cultivated in the emergency room. Emily's body was cold, and her pulse was weak, but she was unmistakably alive. "Does it hurt? Do you feel sick anywhere?" Her nursing instincts kicked in as she began checking vitals. Emily's arms showed injection marks. She had clearly been administered sleeping pills. "Mama made me take medicine. Papa tied me up." Emily's fragmentary words told the gravity of the situation. Insurance fraud. It clicked in Margaret's mind. Her son and daughter-in-law's $6 million debt. Emily's life insurance. And the birth of a male child. All the pieces fit together. Suddenly, her cell phone rang. It was the hospital. "Mom, hurry. Rachel's going into labor." Her son's panicked voice. Margaret made an instant decision. "All right. I'll be right there." After hanging up, she lifted Emily and placed her in her car. However, instead of heading to the hospital where her son and daughter-in-law were, she drove to Ohio Health Riverside Methodist Hospital's emergency room. The hospital where she had worked for 30 years. Where trusted former colleagues were. "Dr. Johnson, please. Examine this child. And call the police." Her old friend, the pediatrician, understood the situation at a glance. A treatment team was immediately assembled, and Emily's protection began. At that moment, another cell phone rang. It was her son. Margaret didn't answer. Right now, her only duty was to save the life before her. Outside the window, Ohio's winter dawn cast a new light of hope. In the emergency treatment room at Riverside Methodist Hospital, doctors were attending to Emily. Large amounts of sleeping medication were detected in her system, and her wrists and ankles showed restraint marks. Test results appeared one after another on the monitor. Malnutrition, dehydration, mild hypothermia, all evidence of abuse. In this hospital where she had worked for 30 years, Margaret now faced the greatest crisis of her life. The white walls and smell of disinfectant. What was once normal now carried an extraordinary tension. Vitals are stabilizing. Blood sedative levels still elevated. Body temperature showing gradual improvement. The medical staff's voices flew back and forth. Each one indicated that Emily's life was still dancing with danger. "Mrs. Wilson, the police are here." A young nurse approached her. Her face showed both sympathy for her former colleague and concern for the gravity of the situation. Emily is no longer in immediate danger. However, Dr. Johnson paused. He had been a trusted colleague and friend for 20 years. This is clearly attempted murder. The sedative dosage was near lethal. Furthermore, there's evidence of chronic abuse over the past few months, restraint marks on wrists and ankles, progressive malnutrition, bruising throughout the body. These are not accidental. Medical records flashed on the monitor. Emily's weight had dropped to 70% of normal over the past 2 months. Intentional starvation. And the drugs detected from the injection marks. Everything pointed to a premeditated crime. Just then, the hallway grew noisy. The sound of emergency transport sirens and hurried footsteps. "Mom! Why did you take Emily?" James burst in, his face contorted. Behind him, Rachel writhed in labor pain. Her white hospital gown was soaked with sweat. "Why? You're asking me why?" Margaret's voice was ice cold. The composure built over 30 years of nursing sustained her. $6 million in debt. Emily's $3 million life insurance policy. And the birth of your long-awaited son. Was it all according to plan? Trying to kill your own child by burying her alive. The blood drained from her son's face. Rachel screamed. Whether from labor pains or guilt was unclear. "No, that's not, we." At that moment, police officers entered the room. The sound of heavy boots echoed in the silent hospital room. "James Wilson, Rachel Wilson. You are under arrest for attempted murder, child abuse, and attempted insurance fraud." Rachel suddenly began screaming hysterically. "We had no choice. The fertility treatment debt, investment fraud, everything was crushing us. If only this child wasn't here, we could have a new life." Her screams echoed throughout the ward. At that moment, she was struck by intense labor pains. "Admit the patient. Prepare the delivery room." The medical team responded swiftly. Rachel to the delivery room. James taken away by police. His back no longer showed any trace of the once proud real estate agent, now just that of a criminal. That night, the truth emerged during interrogation. $4 million for 7 years of fertility treatments. $2 million lost to investment fraud. The desperate couple planned to use Emily's life insurance to pay off their debts. The confirmation that their second child would be a boy pushed them to make their decision. They tried to sacrifice their beloved daughter's life as a ticket to a new life. We started restricting her food 2 months ago. To fake illness, James stated flatly during questioning. His voice now lacked any emotion. Rachel obtained sleeping pills from a former hospital contact. We carefully planned everything so her nurse mother wouldn't notice. We told the funeral home it was severe damage from infection and arranged for the coffin to remain sealed. Each confession tore at Margaret's heart. In Emily's hospital room, Margaret held her sleeping granddaughter's hand. The regular beeping of monitors proved her certain life. The quiet drip of 4 fluids. The stable waveform of the ECG. All testified that her beloved granddaughter was truly alive. And in the adjacent delivery room, Rachel was giving birth to a boy under police surveillance. The birth of a new life and the collapse of a family. Opposing fates intersected within the White Hospital walls. Police officers with warrants quietly walked the corridors. Margaret gazed out the window. Dawn was approaching. 30 years of nursing experience had saved a life, and maternal instinct had prevented a family's destruction. But this wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a new battle. She didn't yet know what light awaited beyond the deep darkness. Only Emily's warm hand conveyed certain hope. 3 months after the incident, on a spring morning, tulips bloomed in Margaret's garden from the bulbs planted in winter. Emily was seriously planting seedlings in a small flower bed in one corner of the garden. "Grandma, is this okay?" Her voice showed signs of gradually returning vitality. After the incident, thanks to swift action by Child Protective Services, Margaret had gained custody of Emily. She was also granted custody of her newborn brother. "Yes, that's very good." Next to Emily, 3-month-old Thomas slept peacefully in his stroller. Her grandson, named after her late husband. Here was the shape of their new family. As details of the incident emerged, support from the local community grew. The St. Michael's Catholic Church community promised to fully support the raising of both children. "Mrs. Wilson, is there anything you need?" Neighbors regularly checked in. Former emergency room colleagues would come to help between their shifts. Meanwhile, her son and daughter-in-law's trial continued. They faced heavy sentences for insurance fraud, child abuse, and attempted murder. Particular attention focused on the cruelty of their plan as its details came to light. Gradually weakening her over 2 months, creating the pretext of serious illness. Then sedating her and placing her alive in a coffin. Margaret still trembles hearing the prosecutor's statement. A crime meticulously planned to avoid detection by a mother with medical knowledge. However, there was one flaw in their plan. Emily's strong will to live. The cloth tape gradually lost its adhesion from her tears and sweat. And when the sleeping medication began to wear off, a faint voice leaked out. If she hadn't heard that. Margaret dreaded to think about it. Grandma, do we have to go to the doctor again? Weekly counseling. Specialists say Emily's trauma care requires a long-term approach. Nights haunted by nightmares. Sudden panic attacks. However, slowly but surely, signs of recovery were becoming visible. Prompted by the incident, Margaret began working in child abuse prevention. She gives lectures to medical professionals at Riverside Methodist Hospital. 30 years of nursing experience and the experience of saving her own granddaughter. Her words, carrying such weight, moved many hearts. Tragedy is never someone else's problem. Every time she speaks, offers of cooperation invariably come from the audience. The network for early detection and prevention of abuse steadily expanded. The flowers planted in the garden shine in the gentle spring sunlight. Emily peeks at her brother's sleeping face and smiles softly. Thomas, when you're bigger, let's plant flowers together. Those words warmed Margaret's heart. True, their family had collapsed. But here was new life and hope. Come on, let's all have lunch. The aroma of Sunday's special apple pie spreads throughout the house. Outside the window, spring breeze blows gently, and garden tulips sparkle in the sunlight. It seemed to herald the beginning